A burlap sack floated down the creek, and when the cowboy, Jace Callahan, tore it open, a tiny voice whispered one word that froze his heart. Mama. From that moment on, nothing in Silver Arroyo would ever be the same. Why was a child left to die in the water? Who wanted her gone, and who would fight to protect her? This is not just a story about survival. It's about how love can defy power, and how family is chosen by the heart, not by blood. Where are you watching from today? Drop a comment below. May your day be filled with blessings, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay with us for many more stories that will touch your soul. The summer sun had barely risen above the mesas when the heat already shimmered across the horizon of Silver Arroyo, New Mexico. The desert exhaled a dry breath, scattering dust in thin veils over the red earth. Cottonwoods clung stubbornly to the creek, their leaves whispering as the water moved slow and shallow. Far off, a hawk circled in the vast expanse of sky. The town itself, tucked between ridges, was still waking. A mercantile with its tin rooster sign groaning in the wind, a gas station where the owner brewed coffee that could peel paint, and the white-trimmed clinic at the far end of Main Street. Silver Arroyo was small, rugged, and unpretentious, much like the cowboy riding its edges that morning. Jace Callahan sat tall in the saddle, his body a sculpted frame hardened by work that never left his hands clean. 32 years old, broad-shouldered and long-limbed, he wore his strength without vanity, each muscle earned through branding cattle, splitting rails, and nights wrestling with silence. His hair, dark brown and brushing his shoulders, was made unruly by wind and sweat. A sleeveless summer shirt clung to his chest, leaving his arms bare to the sun, every line of his body cut sharp as though the desert itself had shaped him. His eyes, a stormy blue-gray, had the habit of narrowing not from suspicion but from weight, as though he carried memories heavier than any saddlebag. Those memories were carved deep. 10 years earlier, a barn fire had swallowed his father in a roar of smoke and flame. Jace had thrown himself into the inferno, dragging out a foal with skin blistering from heat, only to turn and find the roof collapsing. He survived, but his father did not. Since then, Jace learned the language of loss: speak little, trust even less, and keep your heart locked. The people of Silver Arroyo respected him for his grit and his word, but they also knew he was a man apart. The only creature who truly shared his world was Onyx, his Mustang stallion. 10 years old, black as obsidian, Onyx carried the lean power of the desert. His muscles rippled under the saddle, his mane flowed dark as midnight, and amber eyes glowed with intelligence that seemed almost human. A faint white star marked his forehead, a single scar of light against his shadowy coat. Onyx was more than a horse. He was Jace's companion, his last tether to trust. Men whispered that Onyx could read Jace's thoughts, but Jace knew better. They had simply learned to endure together. That morning, they were running fence for the Sloan Ranch. Wire sagged in the heat, posts leaned where cattle pressed, and Jace worked with the same steady patience he always carried. Sweat dampened his shirt, dust clung to his skin, but his movements were practiced, measured. It was the kind of morning that belonged to silence until Onyx halted. The stallion froze mid-stride, ears flicking forward, body tense. Jace immediately stilled his hands on the reins. He trusted Onyx's instincts. The horse stared toward the creek, nostrils flaring. Jace followed his gaze and saw it. Something caught in the slow water, rocking with the current. At first it looked like a bundle of trash, a burlap feed sack half submerged. Folks often tossed refuse into the arroyo, but something about the way it shifted made Jace frown. It was heavy, weighted, and moving not just with the current, but with life. He swung down from the saddle, boots sinking into damp sand. The contrast of desert heat and creek chill wrapped around him as he waded in. The sack was tied with coarse rope, knotted tight. With his calloused fingers he wrestled the knot, teeth gritted, tugging until the fibers gave way. He expected old feed, maybe spoiled grain. What he found hollowed his chest. Inside lay a baby girl. No more than 9 months old, her skin was pale, lips tinged blue, damp hair plastered to her small head. For a heartbeat, Jace thought she was gone, the stillness of her chest a cruel answer. Then came a sound weak, fractured, a gasp that carried a shape almost like a word. Ma, ma. Not a clear plea, but enough. enough to strike Jace to his core, enough to pull memory of his father's last shout, enough to rip through the walls he had built. His breath caught, his hands trembled, betraying him for the first time in years. For one terrifying instant, Jace froze, staring down at the fragile weight in the burlap. Then instinct surged. He gathered her out, wrapping her swiftly in his overshirt, pulling her to his chest. She was ice against his skin. Each breath she took rasped shallow, like a bird fluttering against glass. "I've got you," Jace whispered, voice low but steady, the kind of steadiness that comes when fear and resolve lock together. "Stay with me." He carried her back to shore. Onyx shifted, sensing the urgency, but this time it was no mystical knowledge. Jace gave a sharp whistle and tapped his thigh. The stallion moved instantly, stepping forward. Jace mounted in a fluid motion, cradling the baby in one arm, reins gripped in the other. The Mustang surged forward at the command, hooves striking sparks from the hard ground. They tore across the flats, wind burning Jace's face. Mesquite and sage blurred past. Dust rose in a long ribbon behind. The child whimpered faintly, every sound slicing into Jace's chest. He bent close, murmuring, "Hold on, little one. Don't you let go." He splashed water from his canteen onto a cloth, pressed it gently against her forehead. Tiny fingers, impossibly fragile, latched onto the cloth, then onto his thumb. That grip, fierce in its weakness, nearly undid him. Silver Arroyo appeared ahead, its single main street framed by weathered facades and hanging signs. As Jace thundered into town, heads turned. A clerk in an apron stepped out of the mercantile, a hand half raised in confusion. An old man on a bench gasped, tugging his oxygen mask. A mother gathering laundry shouted for her children to move aside. The sight of Jace Callahan, silent, solitary Jace charging through town with something bundled tight against him, struck like thunder. People fell back, giving space. Murmurs rose. Onyx did not falter, pounding straight through the street, scattering dust and stares. At the far end stood the small white building with green trim, the clinic of Dr. Elias Monroe. Jace pulled hard. Onyx slid to a stop in a cloud of grit. Jace swung down, boots hitting the steps two at a time, shoulder crashing the door wide. The waiting room froze. Behind the desk stood Nora, the receptionist, a woman in her 40s with sharp cheekbones and sharper eyes. She opened her mouth to speak, then saw the child's blue lips and swallowed the words. "Doc!" Jace's voice cracked gravel. The inner door swung open. Dr. Elias Monroe appeared, a man of 55 with graying hair at his temples, round brown eyes steady as bedrock, and a frame softening at the edges but hands that never trembled. Years earlier he had stitched Jace's shoulder after a horse kick, and he had never forgotten the young cowboy who said little but endured pain without flinching. "Bring her here," Monroe ordered, voice clipped but calm. Jace stepped into the exam room, laying the baby on a wool blanket. His large hands lingered, brushing damp hair from her face. "Found her in the creek," he said hoarsely. "Feed sack. She's breathing, but barely." Monroe bent close, stethoscope pressed to her chest, fingers probing gently. His expression grew grave. "Hypothermia. Weak, but she's fighting." Jace stood back, chest heaving from the ride, his overshirt damp against his skin, his fists clenched to stop their shaking. He had thought his heart long since dead to hope, but in the silence of that clinic room, with desert sunlight spilling through the windows, Jace Callahan realized everything had just changed, because a child had floated down the creek, whispered a word, and refused to die. The desert morning broke over Silver Arroyo with a heat that shimmered on the horizon and painted the adobe walls of the town in hues of pale gold. It had been less than a day since Jace Callahan had ridden in like a man possessed, Faith's fragile body bundled against his chest, and the memory of that ride still clung to him like dust in his lungs. The clinic, a squat whitewashed building on the edge of Main Street, smelled of boiled linens and bitter herbs. Inside, quiet hung heavy, except for the rhythmic crackle of the stove that kept the room warm for the baby who had nearly frozen to death in the creek. Jace leaned against the wall, arms crossed over his chest, his muscled shoulders stiff, his sleeveless shirt streaked with trail dirt, and his gray-blue eyes fixed on the infant, as though sheer will could keep her alive. Dr. Elias Monroe, a broad-shouldered man in his 50s with streaks of silver through his black beard, moved with practiced calm. He had been the town's physician for over 20 years, steady as oak, known for saving children during fever outbreaks when others despaired. His hands, thick but gentle, adjusted the blankets around Faith, checked her pulse, and measured each breath as though counting heartbeats could hold her tethered to life. "She's fighting," Monroe murmured, his deep voice filling the quiet. "But she'll need care around the clock. She can't be left alone." He glanced at Jace, whose silence was iron, then turned toward the doorway when the hinges creaked. Clara Vaughn stood there, tall and slender in a modest blue cotton dress, auburn hair pulled back in a loose braid that revealed a face lined with sorrow. 35 years old, she carried herself with the careful dignity of a woman who had endured more than her share of grief. Once she had been quick to laugh, but after the mining accident took her husband and fever claimed her only daughter, the laughter had retreated into quiet reserve. Clara now taught the children of Silver Arroyo, filling her days with chalk dust and arithmetic, but she never allowed herself to cradle another child until this moment. She froze at the threshold, brown eyes wide at the sight of the bundled infant. Her chest rose sharply as though struck, and one hand trembled against her lips. Memories she had buried under routine rushed back with merciless speed. The fevered cries of her daughter, the silence after, the aching emptiness in her arms. Every instinct screamed at her to turn and leave before the old wound ripped open. She took half a step back. Then Faith whimpered, a faint, broken cry, soft but undeniable. Clara's shoulders stiffened, her eyes glossed with tears. "Clara," Monroe said, his tone calm yet weighted with trust. "You've always had steady hands, steadier than most in this town. This child needs more than medicine. She needs care, patience, someone who understands gentleness. I can't think of anyone better." He remembered how Clara had nursed sick school children through winters, how she had volunteered during the last influenza outbreak, never flinching when fear swept others aside. His words struck deep, and Clara's breathing slowed. Still, she shook her head slightly, whispering hoarsely, I can't hold another child." But as if hearing her denial, Faith stirred again, her tiny fist pawing weakly against the blankets. Clara hesitated, torn between flight and instinct. Then she stepped forward, trembling, and when Monroe placed the child into her arms, something shifted. Faith's whimper subsided, her fragile chest rising in steadier rhythm, her fist curling around the fabric of Clara's dress as though anchoring herself there. Jace had witnessed men survive gunfights and horses outrun storms, but nothing stunned him like watching the infant settle against Clara's breast. His jaw tightened, his voice rough. "She knows you." Clara shook her head, but her arms tightened around Faith all the same. The hours turned into a rhythm. Monroe instructed, and together Jace and Clara learned. Jace fumbled with bottles, his calloused hands clumsy against fragile glass, but Clara showed him to test warmth against his wrist until the milk was just right. He struggled with cloth diapers, muttering curses under his breath, until Clara's soft patience steadied his movements. At first, neither spoke much. Grief had taught them silence. Yet in the glow of the oil lamp passing Faith between them, they discovered unspoken understanding, the recognition of two lives scarred by loss, now tethered by a fragile spark of new purpose. By the second evening, the girl's strength grew. She cried not from weakness but from hunger, her voice still delicate yet insistent. It was then Clara looked down at her and said softly, "She needs a name. A soul can't wander nameless." Her brown eyes lifted to Jace, and for a long while the only sound was Faith's small breaths. Jace cleared his throat, his gaze fixed on the child's pale blue eyes, as pale as desert sky after storm. "She clung on when no one wanted her to," he said, like she was hoping for something she couldn't see. Clara's lips curved into the faintest smile, her first in years. "Then call her Faith, because hope carried her through the water, and faith brought her into our arms." Jace nodded once, firmly. Faith. The name seemed to settle into the air as though it had always been hers, but in towns like Silver Arroyo, secrets never lasted. By the end of the week, word of the baby spread. At the mercantile, women whispered while scooping flour, their glances darting toward Clara with sharp judgment. "Living under the same roof as Callahan with a child that isn't hers," one muttered, loud enough to be heard. At the saloon, men speculated over whiskey, some scoffing that a ranch hand had no business raising a baby, others shaking their heads at the cruelty of whoever abandoned her. Children in Clara's classroom carried rumors home. and though Clara continued teaching with composure, she felt the heat of stares in her back when she walked Main Street. Jace, known for his silence, found himself no stranger to confrontation. When two ranchers at the saloon laughed about him playing nursemaid, he fixed them with a stare cold as steel, and the laughter died. "Say what you like," he told them flatly, "but don't say it near her." His fists never unclenched, yet the point was made. For the first time in years, he defended something not with violence, but with conviction. Clara faced her share too. Mrs. Bailey, the widow who ran the general store, stopped her one afternoon, voice sharp. "Folk are talking, Clara. A widow and a cowboy living together, hardly proper." Clara held Faith tighter, her voice steady though her heart pounded. "Folk can talk all they want. This child needs us. That's all that matters." She walked past without another word, but inside her chest, something burned fierce, a courage she hadn't felt since before loss hollowed her life. Outside the little house Clara had opened for Faith, Onyx grazed, his black coat gleaming beneath desert twilight. The Mustang was restless whenever Jace lingered inside too long, pawing the ground, nickering low. It wasn't some mystical intuition, just the bond of a horse who sensed his rider's unease. To Jace, it was enough. Onyx's steady presence outside the window was a reminder that loyalty came in many forms. One evening, as the desert cooled and crickets began their chorus, Jace stood by the crib where Faith slept. Clara sat nearby, her braid undone, lamplight soft on her tired but serene face. Faith's small hand curled around her finger, and Clara hummed a tune she hadn't sung in years. Jace's voice cut low through the quiet. "They can whisper all they like. Doesn't change what's right." Clara met his gaze, and for a moment, the walls of grief each had built began to crumble. The town of Silver Arroyo might drown in gossip, but within that small house, something stronger was taking root. Two broken souls finding strength in each other, and a child who, by sheer will to live, had given them back their names, faith for the baby, and perhaps, in time, redemption for themselves. The night air in Silver Arroyo was heavy with heat, the kind that lingered after a long desert day, pressing against the wooden walls of Clara Vaughn's modest home. The sound of cicadas thrummed in the cottonwoods, and the stars burned sharp and restless above the mesas. Inside, the quiet rhythm of Faith's breathing filled the small room, steady and fragile like a candle against the dark. Clara sat near the crib, her auburn hair loose around her tired face, eyes soft as she traced the curve of the infant's cheek. Across the room, Jace Callahan leaned against the window frame, his muscled arms crossed, his gray-blue eyes fixed on the horizon as if daring it to reveal the trouble he felt brewing. The peace shattered with a sharp knock at the door. Jace straightened instantly, his hand brushing near the handle of his knife, Onyx snorting outside as if sensing the unease. Clara hushed Faith, then opened the door to find Sheriff Eli Williams. Williams was a man of 48, his frame lean from years in the saddle, his sandy hair streaked with gray. Deep lines carved his weathered face, and his brown duster smelled faintly of tobacco and dust. He wasn't a man to waste words, nor to pay social calls this late. When his eyes met Jace's, they held both urgency and hesitation. "Evening, Clara. Jace. Mind if I step in? We need to talk where walls don't have ears." They sat in the lamplight, shadows trembling across the walls. The sheriff kept his hat in his hands, turning it once before he spoke. "There's been questions in town," he said quietly, "about a missing baby. Thornton's household sent his assistant sniffing around. They're offering a reward for information, calling it a family matter. But I've worn this badge long enough to know when something smells rotten." Clara stiffened, her hand clutching the fabric of her skirt. Jace's jaw tightened, the muscles in his forearms flexing under the lamplight. Williams leaned closer, lowering his voice. "A maid from the Thornton house came to me. Maria Gonzalez. She's worked there 15 years, kept their secrets. But this one was eating her alive. She told me something I can't ignore." He paused, eyes flicking to the crib where Faith stirred softly. "The child you pulled from that creek. She ain't just any baby. She's Rebecca Thornton's daughter." The name fell into the room like a hammer on stone. Clara drew a sharp breath, covering her mouth, disbelief clouding her expression. "Rebecca? That girl I taught? She was sent back east for her studies." Her voice shook, torn between memory and doubt. The sheriff shook his head slowly. That was the story they sold. Truth is, she was sent away because she carried a child. A baby born without a father would ruin the Thornton name. The mayor couldn't let that stain touch his family, so he told his daughter the baby died at birth, and then he paid a man to make it true. For a moment, Clara said nothing, her green eyes wide with shock. Then disbelief hardened into anger. They lied to her, made her grieve for nothing. And now they want to drag the baby back, not because they care, but because they're afraid the truth will out. Sheriff Williams sighed, shoulders heavy under the weight of what he carried. Richard Thornton's got ambitions bigger than this town. He's been whispering about running for state office. A scandal like this could tear down everything he's built. He'll do whatever it takes to bury it. Jace finally spoke, his voice low and rough. So he'd rather kill an innocent child than face shame. His hand gripped the back of the chair until the wood creaked. He turned his eyes toward Faith's crib, his hardened face softening as he watched her sleep. That girl's survived hell. She won't be handed back to the same devils who tried to end her life. The sheriff studied him for a long moment. Jace, you know what you're saying means standing against the most powerful man in 3 counties. Thornton owns the bank, half the land, and the judge himself owes him favors. If this comes to a fight in court, you'll be facing law twisted by money. Jace's gray-blue eyes met Williams's steady and unflinching. Then it won't just be law. It'll be right against wrong. And I won't back down. Clara rose from her chair, her face pale but resolute. Nor will I. Her voice trembled, but her spine was straight. I lost a daughter once, Sheriff. I know what it means to bury hope. Faith is no accident. She came to us for a reason. If they try to take her, they'll have to take me first. Williams nodded slowly, standing and setting his hat back on his head. That's what I figured you'd say. I'll do what I can to slow him down, but don't expect miracles. Thornton's reach runs deeper than any badge I wear. Keep that child close and keep your eyes open. He tipped his hat, then slipped into the desert night as quietly as he came. Silence returned, broken only by the rustle of the wind against the shutters. Jace walked to the crib, his broad shoulders heavy with more than the day's labor. Faith stirred, her small fist stretching upward. Jace lowered his hand, and her fingers curled tight around one of his calloused ones. A sound, half whimper and half coo, escaped her lips, and for Jace it felt like a vow sealed in innocence. Clara moved beside him, brushing Faith's golden curls from her forehead. We'll protect her, Jace, she whispered. Her eyes shone with tears, but behind them burned a steady fire. He glanced at her, and for the first time his expression softened into something near a smile. Together, Clara, we stand together. Outside, Onyx pawed the earth beneath the mesquite tree, his black coat shimmering under the rising moon. The Mustang's dark eyes swept the horizon, ears flicking at the distant cry of coyotes. As loyal and restless as his master, he seemed to sense the storm gathering beyond the desert silence. That night, as the stars blazed cold and unblinking over Silver Arroyo, 2 scarred souls sealed their bond over the fragile life of a child born into secrets and lies. Blood tied Faith to power, but love had claimed her first, and in that home lit by a single flickering lamp, Jace Callahan and Clara Vaughn swore she would never return to the shadows from which she had been saved. Evening in Silver Arroyo arrived with a sky bruised in shades of violet and gold, the cicadas humming their endless chorus as the town began to settle into its twilight rhythms. The adobe walls of Clara Vaughn's modest home glowed faintly in the fading sun, while the cottonwoods by the creek swayed in a restless wind that carried both dust and unease. Inside, the air was warm with the quiet crackle of a kerosene lamp, Faith resting drowsily in Clara's arms, her tiny fist tangled in the widow's brown hair. For a brief moment, the world seemed calm, but both Clara and Jace knew peace in Silver Arroyo was always fragile. It was Jace who first heard the distant roll of wheels, the heavy rhythm of hooves on hard-packed dirt. He straightened from where he had been whittling a piece of mesquite wood by the door, blue-gray eyes narrowing as the glow of lanterns crested the street. Onyx shifted in the corral nearby, ears twitching, the black Mustang stamping uneasily as if he too sensed what was coming. Clara looked up, her face pale but composed, for she had already feared this moment would come sooner or later. The carriage that halted before the house was unlike anything that belonged on their dusty street. Black lacquered wood, polished until it gleamed, drawn by two matched bays whose harnesses jingled with silver fittings. Out stepped Mayor Richard Thornton, tall and broad-shouldered despite his advancing age, his silver hair combed immaculately, his tailored coat more suited for a courthouse in Santa Fe than the humble roads of Silver Arroyo. His eyes were cold and gray, the eyes of a man used to being obeyed. Behind him followed Rebecca Thornton, his daughter, a young woman of 19 with pale cheeks and trembling hands. She wore a blue traveling dress trimmed with lace, fine fabric ill-suited for the dust, and her eyes were swollen from tears she could no longer hide. Two uniformed deputies brought up the rear, their expressions flat but watchful, hands resting close to their holsters. This was no simple visit, it was a display of power. Jace stepped onto the porch, muscles taut beneath his sleeveless shirt, the desert twilight catching the sharp lines of his jaw. His voice was steady though low, a sound like gravel sliding over stone. "Evening, Mayor. What business brings you here?" Thornton did not waste time with pleasantries. He gestured toward the window where the faint glow of Clara's lamp revealed the outline of a woman holding a child. "You already know," he said, voice clipped and commanding. "That baby belongs to my family. Hand her over before the law does it for you." Inside, Faith stirred at the sound, her small lips trembling as if she could sense the tension pressing against the walls. Clara pressed her cheek to the child's fine hair, whispering soothing nonsense, but her own heartbeat thundered like a drum. She had lost one child before to fever, and the thought of surrendering Faith to a man who had already tried to erase her from existence filled her with dread. Rebecca stepped forward then, her voice hesitant, her eyes locked on the tiny shadow in Clara's arms. "Please, may I see her?" she asked softly. For a moment, Clara thought she heard genuine longing, but it was drowned quickly by Thornton's bark. "Enough, Rebecca. This is not the time for sentiment." Jace descended the porch steps slowly, placing himself squarely between Thornton and the doorway. He was not foolish enough to reach for his weapon with two deputies watching, but his stance alone was defiance. "You talk of family, Mayor, but I found that child abandoned to die. Family does not bind a babe in a sack and cast her to the creek." Thornton's expression hardened, though his voice carried the polished veneer of politics. "You speak of things you cannot prove. What matters is blood, and by blood she is my granddaughter. I will not have her raised in poverty by strangers who have no claim." Clara could not remain silent. She stepped into the doorway, Faith clutched tightly to her breast, the lamp behind her outlining her slender frame and steady gaze. "She knows nothing of your wealth or your name," Clara said, her voice breaking yet resolute. "She only knows who has held her through the night, who has fed her, who has sung her to sleep. She calls me Mama, because that is what I have been to her." As if to prove her words, Faith let out a sharp wail, frightened by the unfamiliar voices. She clung tighter to Clara's dress, her sobs escalating until the single word tore from her throat, raw and unmistakable. "Mama!" The sound struck like a hammer through the night, echoing against the silent street, and all present felt its weight. Rebecca covered her mouth, her eyes flooding with tears as she staggered back a step. Thornton's jaw clenched, but for the first time his composure faltered. The deputies exchanged uneasy glances, for even hardened men could not ignore the instinctive cry of a child choosing her protector. Onyx snorted sharply in the corral, pawing the earth, not as a symbol, but as a creature unsettled by the charged air. The smell of tension and fear was enough to set any Mustang restless, and his dark eyes rolled as though mirroring the storm brewing between men. Jace's voice cut through the silence, calm but edged with steel. "You can dress this up with papers and titles, but look at her, Mayor. She has chosen where she belongs. You'll have to step through me and every ounce of decency left in this town before you take her from us." Thornton's lips curled into a thin smile, though the anger beneath it was plain. "Careful, Callahan. You play a dangerous game for a man with no standing. Enjoy your defiance while it lasts, because the law will not be swayed by tears and sentiment." He signaled to his deputies and they fell in behind him, though not without glancing once more at the child still clinging to Clara's neck. As the carriage door shut with a hollow thud, Rebecca cast one last glance over her shoulder, her pale face framed in lamplight. Her lips moved soundlessly, a whisper meant only for herself, but Clara thought she could read the words, "Forgive me." Then the carriage rolled away into the darkening street, its wheels grinding against the silence it left behind. Jace turned back toward the doorway, his expression carved in resolve. Clara still rocked Faith against her shoulder, the child's sobs quieting into hiccups as she buried her face in the only mother she knew. For the first time in years, Clara met Jace's gaze without flinching, and in the unspoken space between them lay a vow stronger than any law or bloodline, that they would protect this child, no matter the cost. The courthouse of Silver Arroyo had never held so many restless souls in one morning. It was late autumn, the sky a pale wash of gray, and the wind carried the bite of cold that promised winter was near. The creak of wagon wheels and the murmur of townsfolk filled the square as men in hats and women in shawls gathered near the whitewashed building that stood like a stern sentinel over justice. Inside, the benches were crowded, the air thick with expectation and the scent of dust and old timber. What had begun as whispers in alleys and kitchens now converged here, in the solemn chamber where Judge Horace Parker would decide the fate of a little girl named Faith. Jace Callahan sat at the wooden table on the left, his broad shoulders taut beneath a clean cotton shirt, his sun-darkened skin contrasting the pale light filtering through the tall windows. He looked every inch the cowboy the town knew him to be, strong and steady, with a face cut in stern lines but softened by the child who now perched on Clara Vaughn's lap. Clara, 34, wore a modest navy dress, her auburn hair braided neatly at her nape, her green eyes carrying both fear and resolve. The widow's quiet dignity lent her strength, and though her hands trembled slightly as she held Faith, her expression told everyone she would not surrender the child without a fight. Faith, scarcely a year old, dressed in a simple white gown with a blue ribbon, toyed with a carved wooden horse Jace had made, oblivious to the weight of the moment. On the opposite table sat Mayor Silas Thornton, tall and broad, his silver hair combed with meticulous care, his black suit pressing authority into every seam. His face bore the confidence of a man accustomed to obedience, but his cold gray eyes betrayed the iron hand with which he ruled his household and town. Beside him sat Rebecca Thornton, 19, slender and pale, her honey blonde hair tucked under a bonnet, her youthful beauty diminished by the shadows beneath her eyes. She twisted a handkerchief in her lap, her lips pressed tight, torn between fear of her father and the pull of the daughter she had been told was dead. Judge Parker, a man in his 60s with thinning gray hair and steady brown eyes, entered with his robe brushing the floorboards. He was known for fairness, for seeing beyond power and wealth when truth demanded it. As he struck the gavel, the room hushed. This court is convened to determine custody of the minor child known as Faith. All testimony shall be weighed with care, for the best interest of the child must guide the decision. Mayor Thornton's lawyer, Edwin Briggs, a sharp-eyed man from Santa Fe in a tailored gray suit, rose first. His voice carried the smoothness of practiced rhetoric. Your Honor, this is a matter of simple bloodlines. My client's daughter, Rebecca Thornton, is the natural mother of this child. The family stands ready to provide her with stability, education, and resources far beyond what two unrelated individuals of modest means can offer. The law favors kinship, and blood must not be denied. A murmur rippled through the gallery, but Briggs pressed on, his eyes flicking toward Jace and Clara with practiced disdain. Mr. Callahan is a ranch hand, and Mrs. Vaughn, though a respectable schoolteacher, is not bound to this child by blood or law. Their bond, however heartfelt, is temporary sentiment. The Thornton family offers permanence and propriety. Tom Bradley, the town's lawyer with spectacles slipping down his nose and an honest plainness about him, rose for the defense. Your Honor, we do not dispute lineage. What we dispute is intention and truth. This child was abandoned in Miller's Creek, tied in a sack, left to die. She was not lost, not misplaced, she was discarded. And it was Mr. Callahan who pulled her from the water, who gave her warmth with his own coat, who rode through town with her near-lifeless body pressed against his chest. It was Mrs. Vaughn who tended to her when fever threatened, who soothed her with lullabies when breath came shallow. For weeks, they have given this child not only care, but love, and that bond is not sentiment, it is life. The judge leaned forward, his brow furrowing. And how does the family explain the circumstances of the child's discovery? Edwin Briggs cleared his throat, but before he could answer, Mayor Thornton rose himself, towering and commanding. Your Honor, this entire ordeal is a cruel misunderstanding. My daughter was deceived into believing her child had died. Measures were taken to shield her from scandal, yes, but never was their intent to harm the child. My family only wishes to restore what is rightfully ours. At that, Rebecca's composure cracked. Her voice trembled as she stood, eyes fixed on the judge, though tears blurred her sight. "It is not the whole truth, Your Honor. My father told me my baby died at birth. I wept for months, mourning a child I thought I would never hold. Only now do I see her alive. And it was not fate that kept her from me. It was deception." She turned to her father, her voice breaking. "You lied to me. You made me believe she was gone because you thought her life would shame your name." Gasps rippled through the crowd, and Judge Parker rapped his gavel for order. Rebecca's confession hung heavy in the air. Dr. Elias Monroe, the town physician, was called as witness. He testified with calm precision, recounting the child's condition upon arrival, her hypothermia, her frail breathing, and how both Jace and Clara had remained steadfast through nights of uncertainty. Sheriff Amos Harper, a grizzled man with a lined face, confirmed the sack had been weighed with stones, clear evidence of intent to kill rather than conceal. The courtroom grew restless, outrage stirring in the benches. When Jace took the stand, he stood tall, voice steady but thick with feeling. "I'm no lawyer, no politician. I'm just a man who found a child drowning in silence. I held her in my arms, felt her heartbeat faint against my chest, and I swore I wouldn't let her go. She's more than a name, more than reputation. She's faith, and she knows who her family is." His gaze softened as he looked toward Clara and the baby. "She calls Clara Mama, and lately she has begun to reach for me and whisper, 'Pa, Pa.' That's not taught, that's chosen." Clara's testimony followed, her voice gentle yet resolute. She spoke of nights by lamplight, of rocking faith when fever threatened, of watching the child's eyes brighten as she learned trust. Then she turned to Rebecca, who sat trembling. "I do not seek to erase you," Clara said softly. "You are her mother by blood, and no one can take that from you. But ask yourself, is it love to return her to the arms of the man who cast her aside? Or is it love to let her grow in the arms that saved her and still welcome you into her life, not as a secret, but as her truth?" Rebecca broke then, sobbing openly, covering her face with her hands. The judge allowed her a moment, then asked gently, "Miss Thornton, what is your wish?" She rose unsteadily, her voice barely above a whisper. "I want her safe. I want her loved. I was too weak to protect her before, but I will not be complicit in her losing the only parent she knows. I beg the court, let her stay with them." The room erupted in murmurs, Mayor Thornton red with fury, his fists pounding the table. "This is absurd! You would defy blood and law for sentiment? You would let my daughter's child be raised by strangers?" But the gavel came down hard. Judge Parker's voice rose firm. "Enough. The question before this court is not one of power, nor wealth, nor pride. It is of the best interest of the child. I have listened to testimony. I have seen the truth of what transpired, and I have watched with my own eyes as this little girl clings not to those who abandoned her, but to those who saved her." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of faith shifting in Clara's arms. She squirmed, then reached down toward the floor. Clara, understanding, set her gently on her tiny feet. The child wobbled unsteadily, then with the determination of innocence, toddled across the room. The benches leaned forward, breath held as she stumbled once, then found balance, her small hands reaching toward Jace. "Pa, Pa," she babbled, her voice thin but clear. Jace bent swiftly, arms outstretched, and gathered her against his chest. The child laughed, a small sound, but it rang louder than any argument made that day. Tears shone in his eyes as the judge declared, "This court rules that custody of the child known as Faith shall remain with Jace Callahan and Clara Vaughn. By their care, she has found life and love, and this court shall not tear that bond apart." The room erupted, some in cheers, others in disbelief. Mayor Thornton stormed out, his authority shaken. Rebecca lingered, watching with tearful relief as Faith nestled against Jace's neck. Clara reached across and touched Rebecca's hand softly, a gesture not of rivalry, but of welcome. And for the first time since the trial began, Rebecca allowed herself a fragile smile. The gavel struck again, but the decision had already been made in the heart of every soul present. Faith had chosen, and love had prevailed. The morning sun rose slowly over the rooftops of Willow Creek, its golden light spilling into the narrow streets and casting long shadows against the whitewashed walls of the courthouse. Dust still lingered in the air from the commotion of the trial the day before, and the whole town seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for a new chapter of its own history to be written. For Jace Callahan and Clara Vaughn, the judgment of Judge Parker had not only ended a storm, but had given them a beginning, one carved from pain, courage, and the fierce devotion of love. The courtroom had been packed with townsfolk, and the verdict was still the only subject whispered across the saloon tables and church pews. Faith, the child found on the brink of death by Miller's Creek, was no longer just an abandoned baby, but the living bond between a broken cowboy and a grieving widow. When Judge Parker declared that Faith would remain in their care, there had been cheers, gasps, and a visible shudder of fury in Mayor Silas Thornton's eyes. He had not been toppled from his office by law, but his power was a hollow shell now. The townspeople's respect evaporated as quickly as the morning dew. Men who once rushed to shake his hand now turned away, while women whispered in disgust at how he had deceived his own daughter. Silas still carried himself in his fine suits and broad-brimmed hats, his silver hair combed with meticulous care, but every smile he forced was met with silence. He became a figure that haunted the streets rather than ruled them. Rebecca Thornton, in contrast, had been transformed by truth. No longer her father's silent shadow, she walked through town with her head lowered, yet her steps steadier. The 19-year-old girl with delicate features and pale complexion began to rebuild herself piece by piece. Her hazel eyes, once dimmed by grief, now softened whenever they fell on Faith. She was not called Mama by the child, but when Faith reached for her hand and babbled Auntie, Rebecca felt a fragment of healing in her heart. She accepted this role without resistance, perhaps even with gratitude, for it gave her the chance to love without fear, and to begin again in honesty rather than shame. The days that followed carried the scent of renewal. Jace, with his muscular frame and sun-browned skin, seemed to stand taller now, as though the burden of loneliness he had carried for years had been lifted. His deep-set blue-gray eyes softened when they lingered on Clara and the little girl, and even Onyx, his black Mustang stallion, seemed to sense the change. Onyx, a proud beast with a glossy coat and flowing mane, had always been a companion of solitude, but now he was a witness to joy. Townsfolk began to speak of him not only as Jace's horse, but as a symbol of strength, loyalty, and the fierce spirit that had carried Faith from death's grip into life. Clara Vaughn, too, was transformed. Once known as the quiet widow who kept her grief behind the closed doors of her modest schoolhouse, she now glowed with a warmth the townsfolk had never seen. Her chestnut brown hair, usually pinned neatly, often loosened as she chased Faith through the yard. Her brown eyes, once shadowed by sorrow, now gleamed with tender pride whenever she was called Mama. She had been afraid to love again, but Faith had broken that wall, and Jace had become her unexpected partner in both love and guardianship. Together they moved with a rhythm as natural as breath, one tending to Faith's laughter while the other guarded her steps, one soothing her tears while the other carved toys of wood to keep her hands busy. When Jace and Clara announced their wedding, the town did not whisper in judgment as it once might have, but instead rushed to celebrate. The church was filled with wildflowers gathered by neighbors, and the air smelled of lavender and sage. On the day itself, Onyx stood proudly at the entrance, his black coat brushed until it gleamed like obsidian, his saddle adorned with white ribbons tied by the schoolchildren Clara had once taught. As Clara entered the chapel in a simple cream dress sewn by her own hands, Faith toddled ahead in a little white frock, carrying a basket of daisies that spilled clumsily with each step. Her laughter echoed in the rafters, and the whole congregation burst into smiles and tears. At the altar, Jace stood broad-shouldered and solemn, his calloused hands trembling slightly as he took Clara's. His voice broke only once during the vows, when he promised not only to protect her, but to protect Faith, to be her strength and her guide as long as he drew breath. Clara's eyes brimmed with tears as she whispered her promise to stand by him through storms and stillness alike. And when the preacher asked if any objected, it was Faith herself who clapped her small hands and called out in her clear, innocent voice, "Mama! Papa!" The church roared with laughter and joy, and Jace bent down to scoop her up between them as the congregation cheered. The reception in the churchyard spilled into the evening. Lanterns swung from trees, fiddles played, and laughter rose into the starlit sky. Rebecca stood in the crowd, tears glistening as she watched her daughter dance between the couple who had saved her life. She no longer felt robbed, but instead felt invited into something purer, a family bound not by blood alone, but by choice, by sacrifice, by love. She took Clara's hand at one point and whispered, "Thank you." And Clara, with tears of her own, squeezed her hand in return, whispering back, "We'll raise her together." Time passed, and Willow Creek carried the memory of those days as its own rebirth. Mayor Thornton still walked the streets, but he was no longer greeted with nods of respect, only with curt nods of acknowledgement. His power waned like a dying flame, while Clara and Jace's home became the beacon of warmth. Onyx became a familiar sight in town, often carrying Faith in the saddle before Jace, her little hands gripping the reins as she giggled with delight. The stallion's proud figure against the horizon came to represent resilience and loyalty, and the people of Willow Creek began to call him the heart of the town's new story. Faith grew, not in secrecy or shame, but in abundance of love. She learned her letters from Clara in the schoolhouse, her laughter filling the same walls that once echoed with silence. She learned courage from Jace, who showed her how to ride Onyx, his hand steady at her back as she sat astride the powerful stallion. She learned gentleness from Rebecca, who taught her songs and read her stories in the quiet of the evenings. The child who had been thrown away became the child who anchored 3 broken lives and stitched them together into something whole. And so it was that Willow Creek found its own redemption in the story of one child. Faith grew with her head high and her heart wide open, calling Jace Papa and Clara Mama, while Rebecca became her auntie, a title that carried as much love as any. Onyx grazed in the fields by their home, his figure often seen against the sunsets, a reminder to all who watched that strength and loyalty could save a life. The story of her rescue was told again and again, until it became less a memory than a legend. In the end, it was not law, nor wealth, nor fear that decided her fate. It was love, fierce and unyielding, that shaped her world and the world of those around her. And as the years carried on, Willow Creek thrived, forever changed by the day. A cowboy, a widow, a teacher, a daughter, and a horse refused to let darkness have the last word. Sometimes the greatest miracles are not thunder in the sky or fire in the mountains, but the quiet moments when love refuses to give up. Faith's story reminds us that God can turn ashes into beauty, loss into family, and brokenness into healing. Just as he placed that child in the arms of Jace and Clara, he also places second chances into our lives if only we open our hearts. In our everyday struggles, we may feel abandoned, overlooked, or powerless, but God is always working in the silence, weaving hope where we see none. If he could save this little girl and give her a home, he can bring light into your darkness and purpose into your journey. I invite you to carry this lesson into your life. Never underestimate the power of love, never doubt the quiet hand of God, and always remember that even in the desert places, he can make rivers flow. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope. Leave a comment to tell us what it means to you, and subscribe to the channel for more stories of love and redemption. May God bless you and keep you, today and always. And if you believe in his miracles, write one simple word in the comments. Amen.